Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf, and I am in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm about to go to the Brownstone event I won't name the city till I'm there. But I wanted to read to you my latest Substack called NeoMarxism and the End of Language. The subtitle is How Globalist Oligarchs Are Targeting Western Meaning. Language is changing in America, indeed, probably throughout the West, and the changes are not good. The changes I see being introduced into English speech in America are designed to kill off the practices and assumptions of individual freedom and responsive representation that have also been embedded for generations in us as a people. The language and language practice changes that have arisen in the past few years tend to, quote, deconstruct, a favorite word of the globalist elite, the core concepts upon which the West has been built for 4 millennia. They also tend to subvert the norms of representational government that America has practiced since its founding. The new phrasings, cliches, and speech patterns replace those foundational Western concepts with Marxist, feudalist, and oligarchical concepts. Language, of course, always changes. That is why we distinguish, quote, living from, quote, dead languages. Dead languages have stopped changing because they are not in use by living societies. However, the new language usages that concern me are not from language changing organically the way it used to. That is to say, via changes in sensibility and usage, via new inventions arising and requiring terminologies or old habits, traditions, and objects passing out of memory. In other words, the changes being imposed on our language and language practices are not arising for the same reasons that we no longer talk about, quote, voyageurs rather than salesmen, or why we no longer discuss wielding a, quote, bear bodkin. And you can look that up if you don't know what it is. I didn't. Rather, the same monsters who have taken the rest of human civilization into their grip for the last 2 years to establish their neo-Marxist, feudalist, globalist oligarchy are deliberately driving artificial changes in language and language practices. I'll call the goal of these monsters awkwardly NFGO for short, as we tend to lack a catch-all phrase for this horror. A, quote, neo-Marxist, feudalist, globalist oligarchy sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it isn't. It's neo-Marxist feudalism for you and me, friend, and the pleasures of a globalist oligarchy with the oligarchy's elites at the pinnacle for them. Why does this matter more than slightly? Changes in language are far from trivial. Linguists have pointed out, as I explore in my new book, Facing the Beast, Courage, Faith, and Resistance in a New Dark Age, and it is published next week, that language constructs reality. People can only conceive, understand, communicate about, and act upon what they can name. Thus, language and language practices shape national identity and even individual character. Quote, speakers of different languages develop different cognitive skills and predispositions as shaped by the structures and patterns of their languages, writes Dr. Lera Boroditsky, Associate Professor of Cognitive Science at UCSD, in her essay, Language and the Brain. So your consciousness is affected by your language, which in turn imprints your brain processing. The way you structure information is affected by details as subtle as the direction in which letters flow. Quote, exposure to written language also restructures the brain even when acquired late in life. Even seemingly surface properties such as writing direction, left to right or right to left, have profound consequences for how people attend to, imagine, and organize information, writes Dr. Boroditsky. When certain language practices are altered, they won't just affect how easily people can understand each other. They can actually shut down certain assumptions about freedom and accountability, and thus close down expectations of political representation and individual rights for an entire society. New practices introduced into language can thus chip away at the identities of Westerners, and especially of Americans, to wear down what is most Western and American at the core of their being, to introduce at the level of brain processing acceptance of what would formerly have been alien norms of social conformity, servitude, submissiveness, powerlessness, and hopelessness. So those who wish to destroy America in other material ways, such as by poisoning our pharmaceutical supply, as we discussed in my essay, Facing the Beast, or by buying up our farmland, are not wasting their time in their efforts also to subvert our language. Here are some examples. One, quote, social distancing, quote, public health, quote, public good, quote, public safety. I've written about how Chinese communist ideas popped up like mushrooms overnight when the, quote, pandemic drama was rolled out in 2020. Social distancing became a thing, even though in the individualistic West, the social part of that term was not organic. The phrase lingers threateningly to this very day. Quote, in the pandemic, people needed moments of levity, and Barrymore's crew could avoid spreading the virus by wearing face masks and social distancing. And that's the New Republic, just a couple of weeks ago, September 2023. The social of social distancing, just like the privileging of, quote, public health, as a concept that is supposed to stamp out fragile protests about personal choices or the rise of terms such as, quote, safety and, quote, public safety, and I gather in Europe and Britain, quote, convenience, are being used in ways that are meant to crush faint murmurs about rights and freedoms. And all of these are Marxist usages meant entirely to reorder how we think of humans in groups. We used to have a society made up of individuals. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was famously accused of having said in a 1987 interview in Women's Zone that, quote, there is no such thing as society. I was living in Britain at that time, and, quote, there is no such thing as society was inaccurately attributed to her everywhere, making her sound driven slightly mad with her lust for unfettered individualism. And yet what she really said was, quote, I think we've gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand, quote, I have a problem. It is the government's job to cope with it. Or, quote, I have a problem. I will go and get a grant to cope with it. Quote, I'm homeless. The government must house me. And so they are casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people. And people look to themselves first. It is, I think, one of the tragedies in which many of the benefits we give, which were meant to reassure people that if they were sick or ill, there was a safety net and there was help, that many of the benefits which were meant to help people who were unfortunate, that was the objective, but somehow there are people who have been manipulating the system. When people come and say, but what is the point of working? I can get as much on the dole. End quote. Whether you agree with her or not about the benefits, her larger point was true of Western society. She did not say society does not exist. What she said was, who is society? Individual men and women. Indeed, this premise is the core building block of the Western project. It is also essentially true of the American project. The fact that, quote, society, meaning the direction of a community or a nation, must be made up of the autonomous wills of individual men and women. But terms such as, quote, social distancing, which clearly parallels such Chinese concepts as, quote, social credit score, along with newly empowered terms such as, quote, public safety and even, quote, public health, are being privileged, that is to say, given validity and authority over and above that formerly fundamental Western premise that society is made up of individuals with rights. Phrases such as, quote, social distancing are predicated, in contrast, on the core beliefs of societies that manage the ordering of movements or behaviors of masses of people by compulsion, as they do in China. The repetition of social distancing, public health, public safety, etc., along with the weird little circles on the supermarket floor during 2020 to 2022, telling you where to stand as if you were prisoners getting exercise in a prison yard, all serve to rewire the Western brain to become accustomed to the concept that we can indeed be told where to go, where to stand, whom to touch, whom to avoid, and that our individual rights and wishes are fungible. All this repetition is mind rewiring that undoes the Western brain's original wiring toward liberty. I got into a gentle argument once with a right-on young lady who was speaking with me after I'd been forcibly escorted out of a restaurant in Salem, Oregon, because I was unvaccinated. I found it historically ironic that the restaurant, which would not let me eat alongside the vaccinated diners, had windows plastered with icons of the Black Lives Matter movement. The young lady accused me during our back and forth of, quote, centering yourself. I had never heard that expression before, but it is an important one. It aligns with the Marxist goal of the restructuring of our language. From the Renaissance on, the self has been, quote, centered in the West. This was the great revolutionary innovation of Western consciousness. Thus, that centering of oneself has now been turned into a, quote, social crime. 2, what I can tell you, what I will say, again, as I've said over and over, those are quotes. There's a change in how dialogue is being conducted at a public level now. Questions are being dissevered from answers, and we are being propagandized that that is okay. A feature of the Biden era is that the Western notion that in a representative democracy, your elected officials have to answer you, or at least have to appear to do so, is being demonstrated to be dead. The phrases above form a new set of non-answers that break apart the Western representative democracy premise that our elected or appointed officials are answerable to us. These are highly scripted responses that some media trainer in the Biden administration has imposed on every single public spokesperson. These mannerisms seem to be especially warmly embraced by the women. The phrases manifest along with robotic NLP-style hand gestures that make the speaker look as if she is repetitively dividing dough with the edge of her hand. They are accompanied by that maddening upward vocal lilt when the spokesperson is challenged that sounds exactly like, young man, any more sass from you? This obnoxiously smug tone of voice and set of mannerisms does not just position the speaker as being superior to the questioner, but they also now indicate to the questioner that the speaker's accountability is at will. She or he does not have to give the challenger any answer at all. Former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki and now her successor, Karine Jean-Pierre, used these phrases in response to reporters' questions and especially in response to follow-up questions. The press secretaries also use the off-putting word again before simply repeating what they said before, or the equally mom-ish, as I've said over and over. When these spokespeople are confronted with questions requiring under normal Western expectations actual answers, or at least squirmy Clinton-esque gestures at answers, the spokesmen women are trained to restate their non-answers until the questioner gives up. Here, incredibly enough, is Robin Dunn Marcos, Office of Refugee Resettlement Director, stonewalling Representative Andy Biggs in this way at 4640. What I can tell you, when he asks her about emails sent to staffers whom she manages, raising concerns about hundreds of children in her care who were being trafficked, you can see the Republicans melting in anguish at the wall of willed obtuseness facing them. Variations on this non-response are what I will say, what I will tell you, as if it is perfectly okay now to pick and choose what answer a public official constructs to give to a public question. Karine Jean-Pierre makes use of what I can tell you at 19 seconds in this clip embedded in the piece. This language practice, and I call it a language practice instead of simply a change in language, because it is literally changing the rules of the dance of speech, severing questioning linguistically from any prompt to provide an answer, is dividing Republicans and Democrats, especially in public hearings, dramatically. The Republicans cannot believe how maddeningly childishly the target of their questions is behaving. The repetition of non-answers feels to them like that awful moment all parents will recognize when 8-year-olds realize they can drive adults crazy, and they realize the power this gives them by reiterating ad nauseum, "No, I'm not, you are," or "says you," or by repeating the adult's question verbatim until the kids are finally sent to their rooms. The trouble is, the Republicans can't send anyone who's now doing this to his or her room. You can watch the Republicans devolve in astonishment, writhing in irritation in hearing after hearing, but they remain balked by the non-answerers. The targets of the questions remain stolidly and shamelessly unmoving in their own commitment to non-answers and non-meaning. This refusal to answer in any meaningful way would not have been allowed to pass a mere 3 years ago. You are not answering the question, the subjects would have been told, and eventually the question would be answered grudgingly, or else the person would be charged with contempt of Congress. At the very least, the subjects who stonewalled in this way would be torn to bits in the press, and the administration that sent them out as front people would never be reelected. But now, no. Here is Representative Ayanna Pressley insisting to CNN's Jake Tapper that, quote, the border is secure. He gives her multiple opportunities to correct what is obviously an errant fib, but she refuses to take the opportunity to correct an untruth and insists the border is secure. This divide has now become not just two groups struggling to communicate. This has now become two completely separate worlds of meaning, two different hermeneutical universes with utterly different social rules within one United States of America. Establishing the Baroque non-answer as legitimate is not trivial. Every time we hear an elected official or government employee, a government spokesperson or corporate leader in the crosshairs facing the press give a categorical, bald-faced non-answer answer, it's not just that moment that is frustrating. Over time, with repetition, our brains are being worn down. The goal of our enemies is that we eventually will accept the premise that we do not deserve answers. Questions in public from the public to, quote, officialdom or to elites will soon feel theoretical, cosmetic, or purely rhetorical. Questions themselves will be drained of the positive social valence that they've had in the West. As in any totalitarian system, we will conclude, why even bother asking? Sooner or later, these new linguistic practices and structures will indeed rewire our thought processes so that we will forget that we ever had the expectation of the right to a public answer. That is the goal, the meta goal. Number 3, we are not doing this. Cancel culture, speaking with one voice, just leaving the room. You may have experienced a variation on this new norm in your own personal life, since speech norms from the top of the leadership chain tend to filter down into everyday life. Have you ever been in a debate with someone on the left, someone thoughtful, educated, trained in critical thinking, who recently has begun to announce when he or she has no good answers, we're not doing this? I have. I've literally had people from the left get up and walk out of the room when he or she ran out of good responses in an ordinary debate. A variation on this is the much discussed cancel culture. Again, a recent coinage. In the pre-Marxist past, no one would consider that he or she had the option to cancel as opposed to dispute, ignore, or contest someone else's point of view. Until recently, we understood that the person who stopped debating, who walked away, who gave up the back and forth, had lost. Commentator Steve Kirsch has interviewed a whistleblower, Michael Tsai, who was elected to the Milpitas, California School Board and was told that the board, quote, speaks with one voice. We are going to control what you can and cannot say now, end quote. A mandatory training, quote unquote, was involved. Again, this is a Marxist collectivist approach, yet similar coercions and impositions are taking place nationwide. This may explain the shocking experience I had in Chatham, New York in 2022, when an entire school board got up and walked out when it was asked a direct question by a parent about where certain sums of money had gone. If people can now simply get up and leave a public civic debate with no loss of professional status, or prestige or a threat to their job status, especially if this is true now for our elected officials, we have entered into a post-democratic space in which we can't ever expect to run down the truth in a public context. Quote, call it out. Number 4, Karine Jean-Pierre has said in response to reporting about Hunter Biden, there has been some irresponsible reporting about that family, and so I've got to call that out here. I had never heard the phrase to, quote, call something out in English until 4 or 5 years ago. Then suddenly the phrase was everywhere, with every liberal sophomore on social media scrambling to, quote, call out someone before she or he was, quote, called out in turn, as if in a game of anxious musical chairs. But to, quote, call someone or something out is a Marxist term containing a Marxist concept. Rather than, quote, challenging someone or disagreeing with something or even objecting to something, which positions the critic as an equal among equals, the Western American premise of how people in a democracy contest one another's claims, when you, quote, call someone out, you are holding him or her up censoriously from a top-down position for mob condemnation, for social ostracism and shaming. What is this? What? We have never had that in America. What calling out is prorabotka, a ritual of public shaming that was common in post-Soviet society. In schools, universities, and workplaces in the former Soviet Union, the transgressor was, quote, called out to be shamed in public. As Svetlana Stevenson writes in A Ritual Civil Execution, public shaming meetings in the post-Stalin Soviet Union, Prorobotka, whose genealogy can be traced to early pre-revolutionary years, was aimed at the reinforcement of social norms challenged by public, political, and moral deviance. And the quote is longer, but I'll stop there with that. What are the key words in this article about Soviet shaming? Quote, character assassination, citizens' justice, emotionalization, everyday life in the Soviet Union, informal law, public shaming. Do any of these now sound familiar? And I'll stop there because my Uber is here, and I will read the fifth one and my subsequent essay about additional ways that there's war not just on language but on thought, and how that leads to dehumanization in my next podcast, Outspoken. Thank you so much. This is Naomi Wolf. You can support me on Outspoken. You can support us all, especially those doing the Pfizer documents work, on dailycloud.io. And this is independent journalism. I really need and appreciate your support for me and my team. Thank you so much.